Okay, here. So part two then of chapter 15, we've looked at, prior to this, we've looked at ways to kind of characterize and ways to build a study on various habitats, right, or non-habitats, as the case might be. And so now we're going to actually go in and do a little bit of the nitty-gritty in terms of how do we actually do some of these kinds of studies. And so when we look at what we call habitat studies here, there's really two common ways to do this. We can look at use non-use, or use availability, or selection, right? These two related but slightly different ideas. Habitat use is built around looking at animals themselves, right? What are they doing? Where are they going? Okay, and using the animals and their occupation or not of various parts to look at what parts of the landscape are important for those animals. Habitat selection, here we're looking at having to have some additional information about the environment itself, so some kind of metric to determine not necessarily quality of, but qualities of, not as in good or bad, but as in, say, moist, high cover, low cover, various stuff like that. In addition to sort of whether or not the habitat itself is available to the animal and whether animals are using it. So two very related ideas, but approaching it from slightly different perspectives. One of the issues we've got with using animals for this, or, again, we've talked about this before, any kind of study, is that animals don't really want to be found, right? If you have an animal that's easily found, it's probably not doing a very good job as an animal, right? And so even as you go out and you identify certain individuals of a species, the reality of it is you're never going to see all of them. And that's fine, right, for a sampling kind of issue, right? But the problem is, what if you're looking at use, non-use, right? You're looking at presence or absence, and you say, okay, well, there's nothing here. Well, maybe there was, right? And because you couldn't see it, you didn't mark it down as being there, and this can lead to bias, right? A horribly abused word in the modern world, I'm afraid, but can lead you to bias against presence of an animal in an area, right? And so you need to have some kind of mechanism to control for that, right? You have to have some kind of correction factor based around detection probability, right? As to whether or not this is a true absence or not. And this might be multiple observations within the same habitat area or whatever, okay? But there has to be some mechanism to control for that. Because if you don't, right, the conclusions that you draw based on your false observation of animals not using a particular patch can lead to problems with making poor judgments about management activities or what have you. So one of the things that we as a field, not you specifically, but we as a field are trying to do, right, is develop models here that predict whether or not we would expect to find an animal in a location based upon what we know about what animals use. And I understand that's probably a kind of a confusing idea, but the idea here is that we're going to try to correct for some of these issues here by taking lots and lots and lots and lots and lots and lots of different observations of animals, where are they using things, and what is common to those areas, and say, okay, even if we didn't make a direct observation here, okay, it's got some of these features that might suggest that we would find them there at some point or another, right? And use that to kind of deal with some of this bias issue. For our habitat use studies, right, as opposed to habitat selection studies, again, this is about animals themselves. We're seeing an animal here, it's spending time in this particular spot, what have you, right? So it's very much about what are the resources that an animal is trying to utilize. And so because it's very much that kind of a descriptive science, it is very much a, okay, well, this animal needs this, 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 and this, and this, right? We can, if we have enough of the right kind of data, also do what we call quantitative assessments. We're going to say, you know, an animal needs this much cover, and an animal needs this much standing water per hectare, or whatever, right? But generally speaking, it's more about the animal needs standing water, the animal needs cover. And what we can do with that then is we can say, okay, well, for example, right, we might have a species that needs a nest cavity, right? There need to be nesting cavities for these animals to build a nest, right? A cave, a hollow knot hole in a log or whatever. And so we find environments where, say, all of this stuff is good, but it's missing, say, this one important thing that we know that these animals require. We can make man-made nest cavities, stick them in this environment, and we can increase the available area for these animals to use. So it can be a really powerful mechanism for management, right? If we can find, and this is obviously an extreme example in terms of how easy it is, but it's something that we can use very much to make non-habitats into habitats. With selection, right, as opposed to use, habitat selection here is, it's more about what are the preferences of the animal, right? Of all of the choices available to them, okay, what are animals using as habitat more often than not? Okay, so it's a slightly, again, getting back to that slightly different idea. It's kind of the same notion, same root problem, but we're approaching it from a different angle. One thing that's important to remember here is that just because an animal chooses to use an area doesn't mean it's more important than anything else, right? We go back to this example here. Now, like obviously this is habitat use, right? But an animal would only use this nest cavity for a couple of months out of the year, right? So it's not going to be something that it picks all the time, okay? It's not going to be a selected habitat for 10 months out of the year, right? It's going to be under selection, right? It would be less utilized. But without those nest cavities, they don't live there, right? So you need to kind of free yourself from the idea that commonly used and important are not necessarily the same thing. What it is, right? What it absolutely is, it's not a measure of importance, it's a relative measure of use relative to availability, right? So you go to the grocery store, right? You have all of the food in the entire grocery store available to you, okay? But are you gonna buy one of everything, or are you gonna buy a handful of things that you know how to cook, right? Selection there is, out of this entire thing that you could potentially buy, what do you buy? That's what that's all selection is, okay? Of all of the options that are available to an animal, what are they using? So if we're gonna stick with this very narrow definition here, we do still care about importance, okay? So we need to have, again, as with all things, we need to have some indication of longer term timescales, the biology of the animal, right, to determine within sort of the availability matrix what actually is required and what is not required but chosen for longer periods of time. 3 different ways that we're going to analyze a habitat. So again, coming back to qualities of a habitat, right? Are they sort of high quality? Are they low quality habitat? Are they great breeding habitat? Are they great foraging habitat? Whatever. 3 different ways we can determine that. We can look at a whole bunch of different individuals, right? And see what all of the individuals are doing, right, with their time. Okay. which is certainly one way to do it, right? We can also take all of our individual observations, right, and pool them, okay, and simply say, okay, this deer herd, right, the deer in this deer herd spent this much time there and this much time there and no time there or what have you, okay? So not thinking about deer A did this and deer B did that, but the deer did all of these things, which is what this middle chunk is, right? Notion of disregarding the identities is we don't care if it's a buck, if it's a doe, if it's a particular fawn, it's just the deer, okay? And the last one here is a little bit more tricky, but probably the most powerful. Again, we're going to pool all of our data, but we're going to have a demographic component to it, okay? We're going to retain the idea that deer A did this, this, and this, and this, and deer B did this, 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 and that. And we can use that demographic information, right, to understand how bucks and doe utilize habitat differently, how fawns utilize habitat differently from bucks and does, okay? All of that stuff, okay, is still retained in that. So it's a lot of data to sort of paw through, but it's very powerful. In terms of trying to sample for any of this stuff, there are two main designs, I guess is the right word for this. In terms of doing that, we can talk about use non-use or use availability. Use non-use is the simple one, okay? Is an animal there, right, or is it not? Okay, if an animal's there, it's a habitat, right? And if it's not there, non-habitat. Simple as that, okay? The problem is kind of going back to the big issue of bias we've got, right? If an animal's hard to find, you might say that it's not there, right? And in fact, it is there, okay? And so quantifying or deciding that an area is unused is a trick to this, right? But it's fast, it's easy, it's simple, right? It's here or it's not, right? And then using that bit of information, we can say, okay, well, what's in the places that they are and what's not in the places that they're not. And using that information to kind of say, okay, well, these are the things that are important for a habitat for this animal. A little bit squishier of an idea is what we call a use availability study. And the beauty of a use availability study is that we don't have to say that an animal is not using this area, right? We say of the areas that animals are, okay, where are they spending their time, right? They might be walking through here, but if we catch them there, they're there, right? It's habitat, okay? But are they spending all of their time at the watering hole? Are they spending all of their time foraging for a mast in the forest? What are they doing, right? Within their available habitats, where are they spending their time, okay? So it's a little bit easier on one hand because we don't have to say for sure that this area is unused, but the power of understanding what makes a habitat good or bad or whatever is a little bit weaker. Ultimately, we're going to use all of this stuff here on management decisions, right? And so different ways that we might try to utilize this within management, we might think about, say, managing habitat and what we call plant succession. We talked about the notion of succession before, where plant communities change through time in predictable ways, right? So we go from, say, grassland to scrubland to pine forest to hardwood forest, that kind of notion of succession, okay? A lot of the species that we'll be managing for, particularly game birds, require habitat at multiple different stages of succession, right? For part of their time, they're going to need grassland or scrubland. Part of their time, they're going to need, fast-growing forest, maybe aspen, pine, things like that. And so managing for those species is going to require us to maintain within a relatively small geographic area all of those different successional stages that are needed, right? So that's going to be fire management, right? We talk about using fire as a management tool. This is one way to do that, right? You burn down a section of forest, you start succession over, right? You can do it with clear cutting, although clear cutting has got its own set of issues, because fire does too, right? But just again, kind of as a way of saying, well, this year we're going to do this to this patch and let the rest of them grow, and kind of keep a staggered schedule of management activity. Obviously, human activities, trying to control for human activities is an issue. One big one that's outside your scope as a manager, or will be, is climate change. As climate change continues at alarmingly rapid pace, a lot of habitats that were really good are now changing to be less good. And a lot of habitats that were habitats are now non-habitats, and they're unusable. And so a lot of this is going to be predictive, right? Okay, this area is great now, but in 10 years, what are we going to do? And you want to try to think about that stuff, because you want to plan a few years out. You don't want to just plan for now or plan for next year. You want to plan for, maybe even a decade out. And then, of course, this is also things like, building a subdivision, right? Or taking out a road, or even something, we talk about, managing for what we might consider to be low impact kinds of human behaviors: hiking, camping, fishing. Any human use of a wild area will affect the quality of a habitat. Animals, generally speaking, don't like to hang around people. And so if you've got a highly used hiking trail, for example, the area around that hiking trail, even if it was otherwise perfect, won't be used, right? It becomes unsuitable. It becomes non-habitat at that point. And so again, that's another thing that you need to consider. Obviously, we continue talking about spatial scales, right? The problem with large spatial scales, the larger you get, the more different animals you have to consider, right? It's like government, right? Your mayor only has to care about the citizens of the town you live in, right? But as you get farther out in the government scale, right, you talk about the governor, right? The governor has to care not only about people in your city, but also all the cities in your state, right? And then the federal government, in theory, has to care about everybody, right? I'll leave that to your discretion, I guess. But that's the idea, right? And so as you start managing for larger things, the more different animals, and different plants and things you have to kind of consider. So as you manage for habitat, understand the changes that you make for one species to make a habitat or to increase the quality of a habitat might have positive or negative effects on other species within that same management zone. And you may or may not care, right? It may or may not be an issue. I don't think if you manage for something that increases deer and decreases mosquitoes, people will care. But they might. And so you have to think about that. As far as stuff that's emerging, contemporary challenges that you guys are going to face as you go out into the workforce, population growth is a big one. You might see things on the internet, always a dangerous idea to go on the internet for anything, but where people are talking about, the slowdown in reproductive rates here in this country, right? Saying, oh, we're going to have a population crisis. Well, the thing is that even in the places like here in the United States where population growth is slowing down, it's still not negative. Okay, we still have a positive population growth trend. It's just that it's not growing as fast as it used to. Okay, and then there are, of course, places where population growth is running wild, right? We're not in danger of running out of people anytime soon, right? And the more people there are, obviously, the more impacts we have on habitats around us. And so that's going to be something to consider. You're always going to fight with people about whether or not to put in a new golf course or whether to manage for habitat as wild area or whatever. The other big change here that's going to be kind of moving forward to you here kind of goes back to this pairing up here, right? Prior to 20 years, maybe even more than that, and more recent than that, people haven't cared about multiple species, right? You've managed for deer, you've managed for grouse, you've managed for turkey. And now we're starting to understand that you can't do that. I mean, you can, but it won't work. So we're starting to get kind of, again, this more holistic approach where we're looking at, okay, managing for the environment, managing for the ecosystem, managing for the habitat, and kind of working our way around with that. Okay. All right. So that's all we're going to do here before the third exam. So all chapters 16 and on will be for the final exam. Like I said in the last video, we'll get a study guide up for you soon, and an exam to follow probably the next week.